Irrespective of your own personal reaction to Nintendo's pricing decisions for the Switch 2 and its games, one thing that almost everybody has stated is that whatever the rights and wrongs of the argument, the communication was bad. Fresh from the giddy joy of a brilliant April Direct, people plunged onto the website, and if they looked very, very, very carefully indeed, they might have, with persistence and determination, come across the prices, and then the sticker shock would have hit. Not since the Ice Bucket Challenge went viral would so many people across the world have had such an abrupt cold chill all at once. Whatever it said on Nintendo's marketing plan, getting drop the price hashtags trending, including on their own videos, can't have been on their bingo cards. So, where did it all go wrong? In this video, I want to try to go back to the beginning to see what the marketing options were for Nintendo in terms of their price announcements, and to look at what the counterfactuals were. What were those choices from Nintendo's point of view? What were the roads not taken, and how did we end up here? Let's warp ourselves back in time then to Nintendo's boardroom in January of 2025 as the reveal plan for the Switch 2 was coming out. For the sake of argument, let's assume that there is no option to reverse the price of either the console or Mario Kart. It is, for reasons financial, ideological, or theological, a fixture in the time-space continuum that these would be the prices. The only question in this counterfactual is, how do you break the news to the public in a way that mitigates the threat to the console's launch? The first issue here is expectations management. The general consensus was that a $400 console was likely to be coming out. However, there were some voices, not least mine, expecting higher, and the sticker shock many PlayStation 5 Pro fans experienced had somewhat acclimatized fans to the possibility, at least, of higher price games consoles coming out, including potentially Switch 2. In the case of the games, though, I'm not sure any indication had been issued about the likelihood of any price hike in that regard. The assumption that was widely allowed to develop was that $70 as the standard price of the 2020 consoles would become the default for Nintendo's 2025 model, even though a cursory glance at an inflation calculator would have shown the potential flaws in that logic. And Nintendo has other complexities to deal with, such as the costs of manufacture of game cards over optical media, which, as the game keycard debate is revealing, has its own complexities as well. There was some small precedent in 2023 when they announced a $70 price tag for Tears of the Kingdom, with the logic that the game cards were more expensive to produce given the higher memory requirement, but this was treated as, and indeed was, a rare one-off. Therefore, Mario Kart World leapfrogging not just Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, but almost the entire AAA industry in terms of game price came as a shock to many. I suppose the question is then, how can you reasonably pre-warn people? Tactical leaks to the gaming press, perhaps? It hardly seems Nintendo's style, and as someone who put out videos at least twice in the last year or so expressing that my central expectation was a $450 system and possibly some configuration that pushed the price to $500, I can say that the response to that suggestion was not exactly an Animal Crossing birthday party. In a way, though, there were whispers before. Sakurai has commented on this about his YouTube channel, though as those videos were produced years before, I'm sure he wasn't talking about Switch 2 prices. Still, this was a fairly public way to open up a conversation about prices, and yet the conversation remained broadly on the shelf. No, I don't think informal, whispery rumours were ever going to cut it in terms of warming the market up to the potential of higher game prices and higher console prices. A formal announcement then, that's another possibility, but that is risky. When the only thing you've put out about your console is that it's called Switch 2 and its games are a third pricier than before, that information has nothing to eclipse it in the media space, and so in the information vacuum, those details will be amplified all the more. And when do you time such an announcement? during the leak-intensive period before the January reveal, where rumours would have been swallowed up and spat out and ugly, uncomfortable news was less likely to be taken seriously? Or what about that 2.5 month stint where Nintendo news was basically non existent between January and April, when Nintendo just wanted to be focused on getting their ducks in a row for their Nintendo Today app, their San Francisco store opening, their new theme park section, their massive new console launch, with only Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition to mark out the time until then. During that period, with no other news on the horizon, the details of $80 games would have been the dominant point of discussion in the insular world of gaming for weeks. Now, this might not have been such an issue in some respects. Gamers grumble, but are most likely to have made up their mind definitively on buying the system or not, or at least whether they wish to do so, whether or not they can afford to do so. Of course, some people have furiously claimed to swear off the system, but the opposite of love isn't hate but indifference, and it remains to be seen whether a decade hence that anger remains quite as volcanic. If people had 10 weeks to get the bile out of their system, then it may be that the hashtags and discussion dominating social media after the launch would have been broadly more positive in nature, as the news would have been old by that point and some people would have got bored of complaining about it. But equally likely, in a vacuum of information, there would have been a time aplenty for a lot of articles to be writing easy, rage bait headlines about game prices chipping away at Nintendo's decent reputation, and on the day of the April Direct itself, the headline writers would have already got their copy and their angle locked in, which would be rage against the new machine. All things considered, I don't think this is a strategy that was worth consideration, and apart from anything else, I don't think they had made a final decision in January. They had to take into account all sorts of factors, and they obviously wanted a very latest, up-to-the-minute economic information before taking the plunge. Plus, even then they were blindsided within hours by issues in the US relating to tariff arrangements. Perhaps by the time the February investors presentation rolled around, they could have made a reference to it, but frankly, this is market-sensitive information, and I'm not sure Shuntaro Furukawa would be seen to be doing his job very well if Nintendo stock tanked after an unforced comment at an investors briefing. So, perhaps then the earliest they could have fessed up is that short window between the March and April directs. Of course, the controversy then would have eclipsed the launch and probably depressed early attention to Switch 2. The same issue would persist of people not giving the system a fair chance and prejudging it, and even pre-writing copy in the game's press to the system's detriment. However, the window would be considerably compressed in which that kind of negativity could fester, because it would be up against a wall of hype. And here's where a different kind of problem would creep in. Now the challenge becomes, you said the console is this price, and so now we expect something that spits out gold bars, can take you to the moon, and probably has about 8 top-tier franchises at launch, plus Advance Wars. Even those consumers open to viewing the presentation with an open mind would not be viewing the content purely on its own merits, but viewing it as the answer to a kind of challenge. And some people would doubtless be interrogating each and every frame to see if they could see every dollar at work in the new proposition. It's a terrible situation for any launch to have the burden of this kind of expectation, and arguably we saw a little of this with the Mario Kart World Direct, which was, perfectly fine and typical of these kinds of game-specific showcases over the years, but was received as a grim disappointment by many who wanted Nintendo to show untold wonders to justify the $80 price point. While I think it would have been optimal to introduce the concept before the presentation, I understand that ultimately it might not have been feasible. Okay, so what about revealing the price details during the presentation itself? After all, The price of the Nintendo Switch was revealed early on during the January presentation, and it's not like $299 at that point was considered particularly affordable either. Most people had been expecting $250, but the interest in Nintendo was far lower after the Wii U and the relatively quiet 3DS eras. Certainly, there was nothing resembling the huge groundswell of dedicated followers that the Nintendo Switch has enjoyed. In other words, the stakes were far lower. However, I think at this point we also have to consider and recognize that there is an element of honesty that should come into play. If you want to sell a product to a customer, it is incumbent upon you to be able to look them in the eye and justify your price. Moreover, Nintendo clearly realized that this price would be a wrench. They had thought about this, and Shuntaro Furukawa discussed the matter in the February Q&A. Of course, there are issues here too. The Direct is an international event, and while the prices were steep the world over, they were shallower in terms of increases in Japan for the Japanese language edition. Now, I have a separate video which shows that when you adjust for cost of living issues, Japan actually doesn't really have it much better than anyone else, but either way, they would want to be careful with launching price announcements that would be different in different territories. I think it's also necessary for them not to bias anybody's thinking ahead of time by overly anticipating a negative reaction. Even if Shuntaro Furukawa had come out himself with a black tie and, with glassy eyes and a trembling jaw, whispered his undying regret at the sticker on a video game, it may have mollified a tiny fraction of the audience, but an equally significant part of that audience who was caught up in the hype might have been pulled out of it to reflect on the significance of a price tag that they might otherwise have accepted as just the necessary face value without thinking too much more into it. Sometimes the absolute worst thing to do is to call attention to something you know is a problem for fear of magnifying it in the eyes of your audience all the more. So, what about at the end of the presentation? Get all the good stuff out of the way and then say, look, this is the price. Well, this is a tricky one too. Generally, you want to save for the end some kind of high point. There is a psychological phenomenon where the start and end of things tend to be more memorable and they colour the rest of an experience when recollected. Ending with a cup of cold sick being thrown on viewers might not exactly have helped matters, and even if they put information up about the price, they are not routinely in the manner of discussing game prices in these kinds of presentation, and it's arguably the game prices more than the console price which felt the most problematic to people. I guess they could have said about the $500 bundle that this represents 60% off the purchase price, which would have stealth dropped the price, but wouldn't exactly have scored them any popularity points in terms of clarity of message. At the end of the day, I still think the presentation was probably the best time to launch the information in a matter-of-fact way, such as the system will be $450 or $500 with this limited edition bundle. Done. The games, though, are really much trickier to address because they hadn't announced all the games until the presentation was over, so even if they flashed an infographic on screen briefly showing the prices of their core games, it would be incomplete unless they did it right at the end. It's not like they could say games will usually be $70 or games will be up to $80, as neither statement is necessarily safe. They can only really talk about the games as they come out in specific cases. Even adding recommended retail prices at the end of each game trailer would have been difficult to do, as there are so many regions Nintendo operate in, and they hadn't even announced them all at that point. Plus, it sets a tricky precedent if they start putting prices at the end of game trailers. At any discussion of price, some people would definitely have switched off the Direct at that point, no question. YouTube analytics are pretty exhausted, so Nintendo would have been able to see to the second where people dropped off, and I imagine a retention graph that looked like the line drawing of the White Cliffs of Dover. And honestly, it wouldn't have mattered a jot to the sales of the system early on, and possibly not even in the long term, given that the information was inevitably going to emerge anyway. In other words, while I think waiting until people stumbled upon the price on the website was inelegant, I also suspect it may have been the least bad choice, or one of the least bad choices. Now, having said that, they didn't need to add insult to injury by making the website weirdly coy about revealing the pricing information. This was not just, in my opinion, foolish, but it was also self-defeating, and people had to spend more time digging to find price info, and so it only emphasized to them the pricing issues because it stuck in the memory more through the effort of having to find it. Another issue was the lack of press around it. With the interviews of Doug Bowser and others that took place alongside the direct embargoed until after the weekend to give the system news time to breathe, well, that was days and days in which the speculation was allowed to run roughshod, and when Doug Bowser's words finally aired, they were already feeling out of date. There is the time-honored masochism strategy in media of putting yourself out there and taking every single possible question until finally all questions are exhausted and the topic seems to be done. But Nintendo doesn't want that. They don't want pages and pages of interview copy about the intricacies of pricing and every single possible angle about how they decide to price a machine. The variable pricing language Bowser used is particularly interesting to me because he could, and yet doesn't, mention any of the other obvious issues, not least inflation. It is actually a much worse statement for consumers going forward because it's suggesting that there is no commitment to freeze prices as the company broadly did for Switch 1 titles, with $60 remaining the price point not just at the beginning of the system's life but throughout it. But then again, few would expect them to deny themselves the wiggle room of being able to offer a differentiated pricing structure where needed, especially if the Switch 2 had a decades-long run and inflation keeps rumbling along. Even keeping the interview embargoed served a certain kind of purpose in that if those discussions around price were happening, Nintendo were at least adding no fuel to the fire during that first weekend. By the time Bowser's words were announced, the shock had burned itself out, and so it was less likely to be absolute stop the gaming press news. If this seems like I'm just trying to air quotes defend Nintendo, I'm really not. I came to this from the perspective of the received wisdom that this was a communications blunder, an unforced error. And that certainly seems to be the view of Kit and Krista, whose channel and podcast I love, and who are actually marketing experts with experience of marketing for Nintendo. But honestly, as I look through all the options, I do start to wonder. Very clearly, there is no good option. The only choice is which is the least bad one. And while I think there are plenty of points where reasonable people could make choices either way, I'm not actually sure there is a single point where it really made sense for them to divert from the path they took. And of course, Kit and Krista, and this is no slight on them, are going to be looking for different marketing-led solutions. But the risk is that to a hammer, every problem is a nail, and to a marketer, every problem is a communications issue. I just wonder whether, on a more deep level, this was just a problem that they were never going to be able to patch with communications. It just had to be put out there and dealt with and moved past. But the thing to consider here is opportunity cost as well. Let's say Doug Bowser did do that masochism strategy, a 4-hour live press conference with every journalist under the sun and people messaging in. At what point would the drop the price people have gone, actually, you know what, they should probably raise the price of anything, that sounds reasonable. It was never going to happen, and talking about price at all was obviously a loser for them. There was absolutely no upside for them. The only thing they could hype up is the unique value proposition of the games and the console as they see it. Of course, there is yet another option that they could have gone with, and that is not to reveal the price with the direct at all, and to say that they would announce this ahead of the launch at a later date. This may, oddly enough, have benefited them, given that, in an American context at least, the issue of prices became far more pertinent due to abrupt changes to tariff settlements, but it would have hurt their ability to brief retailers and probably caused all sorts of other issues, as well as a lot of negative speculation in any event. Leaks would have been almost certain as well, so it would have been a publicity nightmare. The other thing is that you really want a stinker announcement like this price to be in the midst of several other Switch 2 headlines. If the price is sharing column inches with Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Kirby Air Riders, and more, then there is scope for it to dominate the conversation far less. Waiting a week would have undone their hard work, and it would have been the only talk of the town. But what do you think? When would you have made the announcement if you were Nintendo, and how would you have done so? 499 red balloons raising up from their Redmond offices? Have Mario explode in a cart out of an 80th birthday party cake? Do let me know. Thank you to everybody for listening, and a huge thanks to the Patreon members of this channel who do help keep this show on the road. Please do check these videos out, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.